A warning with no limits. The waters of the Strait of Hormuz have fallen quiet once again, but not because peace has returned. Instead, the silence reflects a new phase of uncertainty. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has issued one of its strongest warnings since the latest escalation began, declaring that the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed for as long as the United States continues what Tehran describes as acts of aggression. Yet the warning reaches beyond the strait itself. Iranian officials are now signaling that other regional oil and gas export corridors could also become targets. No specific routes have been identified, and no timeline has been announced. That ambiguity appears intentional. In global energy markets, uncertainty can be as disruptive as direct military action. Traders can prepare for a single closed shipping lane, but planning for multiple potential disruptions across an entire region presents a far greater challenge. These alternative export routes are far more than backup options on a map. They include pipelines supplying neighboring economies and maritime corridors that have quietly supported global energy trade whenever conditions in the strait became unstable. For decades, they have been viewed as reliable alternatives, precisely because they were never expected to come under direct threat. If even one of those channels were interrupted, the consequences would extend well beyond the Middle East. Refineries across Asia could face delayed deliveries, European energy markets might experience renewed pressure, and fuel prices could rise in countries thousands of kilometers away from the Gulf. In today's interconnected economy, disruptions to a single strategic corridor rarely remain local. They ripple through global supply chains, financial markets, and national economies with remarkable speed. While Tehran was issuing its latest warning, the United States was already conducting another round of military operations. U.S. Central Command confirmed a fresh series of drone strikes, air operations, and naval attacks targeting Iranian military positions early Wednesday morning, only hours after a separate 7-hour campaign had concluded. According to CENTCOM, the objective was to further reduce Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping moving through the Strait of Hormuz. A significant portion of the operation focused on Greater Tunb Island, where coastal defense systems and cruise missile facilities were targeted during a sustained 90-minute assault. Military analysts note that the sequence of strikes appears carefully planned, beginning with coastal defenses, before moving against missile storage and launch capabilities in an effort to systematically reduce Iran's operational reach. For the commercial tankers still navigating these waters, every pause between military operations has become another moment of calculated risk, where uncertainty itself has become one of the most dangerous factors shaping the crisis. Escalating words, escalating stakes. As military operations intensified across the Gulf, the political rhetoric coming from Washington became noticeably stronger. In a televised interview on Tuesday evening, President Trump warned that if Iran refused to return to negotiations, the United States would expand its list of potential targets beyond military facilities. He stated that bridges and power infrastructure could be struck, while adding that energy-related facilities would remain later options if the conflict continued. The remarks represented a significant shift in tone. Until now, most military operations had focused on radar installations, missile batteries, naval assets, and other military objectives. Bridges, power stations, and electrical infrastructure serve an entirely different purpose. They support transportation, hospitals, water systems, communications, and the daily functioning of civilian life, making any discussion of targeting them especially significant under international law. This was not the first time such warnings had emerged. Earlier this year, similar comments regarding Iranian civilian infrastructure prompted criticism from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who reiterated that intentionally targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure would violate international humanitarian law. Although those concerns faded during the ceasefire period, they have now returned as tensions continue rising. The distinction between military and civilian targets remains fundamental. Destroying a missile launcher directly affects military capability, while disabling a bridge or power plant can disrupt transportation, healthcare, emergency services, and essential public utilities for entire communities. That difference explains why threats involving civilian infrastructure receive immediate international attention, and why governments and legal experts continue monitoring such statements closely. For now, these remarks remain political declarations rather than confirmed military plans. Even so, recent events have shown that public warnings can rapidly evolve into military action, leading many observers to treat every official statement with increasing caution. Alongside these security concerns, another important shift has emerged on the economic front. Only weeks ago, proposals involving a 20% transit fee for vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz under American protection generated widespread criticism, with opponents questioning both their legal basis and practical enforcement. That proposal now appears to have quietly faded. In its place, President Trump has emphasized the possibility of major trade and investment agreements with Gulf nations, describing them as large-scale economic partnerships designed to strengthen regional cooperation. Whether this represents a genuine change in policy or simply a different method of pursuing similar strategic goals remains uncertain. Some analysts interpret the move as a practical adjustment away from a legally controversial proposal, while others believe deeper economic partnerships could ultimately provide Washington with even greater long-term influence throughout the Gulf. Regardless of the motivation, one trend has become increasingly clear. The economic dimension of this confrontation is evolving just as rapidly as the military one, leaving regional governments to balance security concerns with growing political and commercial pressures. The blockade comes back. While the headlines focused on diplomatic statements and military operations, another significant development unfolded at sea. On Tuesday evening, the United States reinstated a naval blockade around Iranian ports, preventing commercial vessels from entering or departing Iranian coastal waters. The measure was not entirely new. It represented the return of restrictions that had been suspended only weeks earlier under the Memorandum of Understanding signed in Switzerland, the same agreement that had briefly raised hopes of reducing tensions. Its reintroduction carried considerable symbolic importance, signaling that the diplomatic framework established during those negotiations had effectively broken down. For commercial shipping companies, the consequences were immediate. Cargo vessels bound for Iranian ports now faced extended transit times, costly rerouting, rising insurance premiums, and growing uncertainty about future operations. Every captain navigating nearby waters suddenly had to consider the additional risks created by a conflict in which civilian shipping had become increasingly vulnerable. Iran responded quickly with another warning, directed not only at Washington, but at global energy markets as a whole. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared that the United States should expect disruptions affecting additional oil and gas export routes serving American and allied interests. Once again, Iranian officials declined to identify specific corridors, leaving considerable uncertainty about which infrastructure might be affected. That ambiguity itself has become part of the strategic calculation. If the Strait of Hormuz can no longer be considered secure, other export routes that support regional and international energy supplies may also come under increasing pressure. As a result, energy analysts are no longer concentrating on a single maritime choke point. Instead, they are evaluating multiple shipping lanes, pipelines, and export terminals that could potentially become future flashpoints. For global markets, uncertainty of this nature is exceptionally difficult to manage. A disruption affecting one well-defined shipping lane can be analyzed, measured, and incorporated into commercial planning. A warning involving an unspecified number of potential routes creates a far more complex challenge. Energy companies, insurers, freight operators, and governments must now prepare contingency plans for scenarios that remain undefined, increasing operational costs long before any additional infrastructure is actually disrupted. Those preparations ripple throughout international supply chains, affecting freight rates, insurance costs, commodity prices, and broader economic forecasts. As commercial shipping companies adapt to these growing risks, it has become increasingly evident that the consequences of this confrontation extend well beyond military operations. They are reshaping the economic landscape of one of the world's most strategically important energy regions. According to Iran's state broadcaster, the country's armed forces carried out a new series of operations this week, targeting locations connected to the United States across 3 different countries: Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain. These are not random locations. Each hosts important American military infrastructure, logistics hubs, and regional defense facilities. By expanding operations beyond the Strait of Hormuz itself, Iran appeared to send a broader strategic message. Any confrontation with Washington may no longer remain confined to a single waterway or even a single country. Officials in each of the 3 nations later reported similar incidents, saying drones and missiles launched from Iranian territory had been intercepted before reaching their intended targets. Neither side has provided a complete public assessment of any damage, leaving much of the situation unclear. What stands out most is not only the number of countries now involved, but the speed at which the conflict has widened. Only days ago, international attention was focused almost entirely on a disputed shipping lane inside the Strait of Hormuz. Now, military activity has spread across multiple borders, drawing several American allies directly into the crisis. For governments that host U.S. military forces, the risks have changed dramatically. Cooperation that once seemed routine has suddenly become a potential source of direct military pressure. Gulf capitals that spent months trying to remain outside the confrontation now find themselves increasingly drawn into it, not because of decisions they made, but because of their geographic position within a rapidly expanding regional conflict. As each new strike is followed by another response, the pattern has become increasingly familiar. One operation leads to retaliation leads to new warnings, and every new development pushes the conflict one step further beyond its original boundaries. What began as tensions surrounding one strategic waterway now carries implications for the security architecture of the entire Gulf region. With multiple countries now caught between competing military actions and diplomatic accusations, the possibility of containing the crisis grows more difficult by the day. Where this leaves the world, looking beyond the individual strikes and official statements, a much larger picture begins to emerge. The ceasefire signed in Switzerland was intended to bring stability and prevent exactly this type of escalation. Instead, it has become the very agreement both Washington and Tehran now accuse each other of violating. At the center of everything remains the Strait of Hormuz, not simply as one of the world's most important shipping lanes, but as a symbol of influence, deterrence, and control over global energy trade. Every new development adds another layer of uncertainty. A renewed blockade, warnings directed at civilian infrastructure, threats against additional export routes, and military operations spreading across multiple countries. Individually, each event might have been manageable. Together, however, they point toward a conflict that is expanding geographically, economically, and diplomatically all at once. Oil prices have already reacted to the uncertainty. Tanker traffic through the strait has slowed significantly, and shipping companies continue reassessing routes, insurance premiums, and delivery schedules almost every day. Financial markets now find themselves responding not only to confirmed military operations, but also to the growing possibility of what could happen next. Behind every headline about blockades and missile strikes are ordinary people whose lives are shaped by decisions far beyond their control. Sailors continue navigating increasingly dangerous waters. Families live near military installations that could become future targets. Businesses face rising transportation costs, while consumers around the world ultimately feel the consequences through higher fuel and energy prices. The farther this conflict spreads, the more difficult it becomes to separate military strategy from its very real impact on millions of civilians who have no direct role in the confrontation itself. A familiar pattern, a new scale. None of this is entirely without precedent. The Strait of Hormuz has witnessed repeated moments of tension over the past several decades, from naval standoffs to isolated incidents that briefly threatened wider confrontation. On previous occasions, diplomacy, military restraint, and simple exhaustion eventually prevented those crises from developing into full regional wars. But this time, the scale of escalation appears noticeably different. Within a single week, the region has experienced the return of a naval blockade, renewed threats involving civilian infrastructure, warnings covering multiple energy export routes, and military activity stretching across several countries simultaneously. Unlike earlier confrontations that unfolded one step at a time, today's crisis is advancing along multiple tracks at once. Military operations, economic pressure, diplomatic disputes, and energy security are all becoming interconnected, making the situation far more difficult to manage. Every new decision taken by one side immediately influences the calculations of the other, leaving much less room for the careful diplomacy that has helped prevent wider conflict in the past. As more governments become involved, even indirectly, the risks of misunderstanding or unintended escalation continue to grow. Despite the rising tensions, diplomatic efforts have not disappeared entirely. Oman continues serving as an important communication channel between Washington and Tehran, while several Gulf states quietly encourage dialogue behind closed doors, fully aware that a larger regional war would carry enormous economic and humanitarian costs for everyone involved. Whether these diplomatic channels can keep pace with the speed of military developments remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that opportunities for de-escalation still exist, if both sides decide they are prepared to use them. The price of not knowing. Beyond the military operations and official statements lies another consequence that often receives far less attention: the cost of uncertainty itself. Every day the Strait of Hormuz operates below normal capacity, millions of barrels of energy move more slowly through global markets. Refineries adjust production schedules, power companies search for alternative fuel supplies, and governments begin reviewing emergency reserves. Although the conflict is centered in the Gulf, its economic consequences extend far beyond the region, eventually reaching households around the world through higher electricity bills, increased transportation costs, and more expensive fuel. For international shipping companies, uncertainty has become one of the greatest challenges. Insurance premiums for vessels traveling through the strait have risen sharply, while every new warning, whether directed at infrastructure, shipping routes, or military targets, adds another layer of financial risk. Some companies have delayed departures altogether, keeping ships outside the region until conditions become clearer. Others have accepted the higher costs of longer alternative routes, rather than expose crews and cargo to growing dangers inside one of the world's busiest maritime corridors. When these individual decisions are repeated across the global shipping industry, the cumulative impact becomes significant enough to influence economic forecasts far beyond the Middle East. For now, the military operations continue. The blockade remains in place, and one of the world's most strategically important waterways stays under extraordinary pressure. Whether the coming weeks bring renewed diplomacy or further escalation remains uncertain, but one reality has already become clear. The longer uncertainty persists, the greater its consequences will be, not only for the countries directly involved, but for the global economy that depends on stability in the Strait of Hormuz.